The helicopter dropped away and the sound of its rotors faded quickly, swallowed by the jungle canopy and the distance. What remained was the familiar background noise of Vietnam's central highlands, insects, distant birds, the soft shifting of gear, and the quiet awareness that the patrol was now alone. It was late morning in May of 1969. The rain had not started yet, but the humidity already sat heavy on the skin, making uniforms cling and turning every movement into effort. The terrain was uneven, rising and falling in shallow folds that made distance difficult to judge. Thick vegetation limited visibility to a few dozen meters at best. The platoon moved cautiously along a narrow trail that had once been used by local farmers and was now suspected of being part of a secondary infiltration route feeding into the lowlands. There were no signs of recent contact, no fresh footprints. No disturbed foliage obvious enough to justify calling it an ambush site, but that meant little. In Vietnam, the absence of signs was often deliberate. Walking near the middle of the formation was the platoon medic, Specialist 4th Class Thomas Keegan. He was 21 years old and carried an aid bag that weighed nearly as much as a rucksack full of ammunition. He had been in country for 6 months, long enough to understand what the job actually meant, not long enough to be comfortable with it. Keegan's weapon hung loosely across his chest, but it was rarely what he reached for first. His attention stayed fixed on the men around him, their spacing, their posture, the way they moved. A medic learned to read people quickly. A limp might mean a blister turning septic. A slumped posture might mean heat exhaustion starting to take hold. Not every injury in Vietnam came from bullets. Field medics were trained to operate independently under fire. Their instruction emphasized speed, prioritization, and improvisation. They were taught that treatment did not begin when the shooting stopped. It began while it was still happening. Keegan had memorized his aid bag by touch. He could find morphine, bandages, tourniquets, chest seals, and IV tubing without looking. He practiced this in darkness because darkness was when he would need it. Just before noon, the point man froze. The signal moved back through the formation in silence. Men crouched instinctively. Weapons came up. Keegan felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with anticipation rather than fear. Fear came later when there was time to think. A single burst of automatic fire shattered the stillness. It came from the left, close, followed by a second burst and the sharp crack of rifles. The sound was disorienting, amplified by the trees. Someone shouted, someone else fell. The platoon reacted immediately, returning fire toward the suspected positions. Leaves and branches disintegrated under incoming rounds. The enemy remained mostly unseen, firing from concealed positions along a shallow ridgeline. Keegan moved without waiting for orders. The first casualty was lying on his back, partially shielded by a fallen log. A rifleman, hit in the thigh, bleeding heavily but conscious. Keegan slid in beside him, ignoring rounds snapping overhead. The first rule drilled into every combat medic was simple: stop the bleeding. Keegan cut away fabric with scissors, exposing the wound. The entry was small, the exit larger. Bright arterial blood confirmed the danger immediately. He applied a tourniquet high on the leg and tightened until the bleeding slowed, then stopped. The rifleman's face was pale. Shock was already beginning. Keegan spoke calmly, keeping his voice steady. He checked airway and breathing quickly, no chest involvement. That was good. He marked the time of tourniquet application on the man's helmet band with a grease pencil. That detail mattered later. Gunfire continued around them. The platoon was attempting to maneuver, but the terrain limited options. This was not a set-piece battle. It was a sudden, close engagement that would be over quickly or become much worse. Keegan crawled to the next wounded man. This one was not responding. He had been hit in the upper torso. Blood bubbled at the wound with each shallow breath. A sucking chest wound, the most dangerous injury Keegan could treat outside of catastrophic head trauma. Chest wounds in Vietnam were particularly lethal. Evacuation might take minutes or hours. Without intervention, the lung would collapse completely. Keegan applied a chest seal with practiced efficiency, taping 3 sides to create a one-way valve. He listened closely, watching the man's breathing stabilize slightly. It was not a solution, it was a delay. Delaying death was often the best a medic could do. The firefight ended as abruptly as it began. The enemy withdrew, leaving behind silence and uncertainty. No clear bodies, no confirmation of casualties, just spent casings and damaged vegetation. The platoon leader moved through the formation, checking status. 2 wounded, no fatalities for now. Keegan focused on reassessment. Combat medicine in Vietnam was a cycle: treat, reassess, treat again. Conditions changed rapidly, bleeding restarted, shock deepened. Infections began almost immediately in tropical conditions. The humidity and heat accelerated everything. Sweat mixed with blood, bandages soaked through faster than expected. Sterility was a concept, not a reality. Keegan started an IV on the chest wound casualty, improvising stability by bracing his hands against the man's body as the ground shifted beneath them. The fluid was meant to prevent shock, not fix the injury. Evacuation was requested. Medevac helicopters were one of the defining features of the Vietnam War. They dramatically increased survival rates, but they also shaped tactics. Units took risks knowing evacuation was possible. Enemy forces targeted landing zones deliberately. The landing zone selected was a small clearing about 200 meters away. Getting there would be another problem. Keegan coordinated movement of the wounded. The man with the leg wound could be assisted. The chest wound casualty would need to be carried. This was where medics often faced their greatest strain. Treatment was only half the job. Movement under threat finished the rest. They moved slowly. Every snap of a branch triggered reflexive tension. Every pause felt like an invitation for renewed contact. The clearing came into view just as the helicopter approached. Rotor wash flattened grass and debris. Dust and leaves filled the air. The enemy did not fire. The wounded were loaded quickly. Keegan shouted critical details to the crew chief over the noise. Tourniquet time, chest wound, IV running. Then the helicopter lifted away. Keegan stood in the clearing, suddenly aware of the fatigue in his arms and legs. The adrenaline ebbed. What remained was exhaustion. The platoon continued its patrol. For Keegan, the day was not over. Field medics in Vietnam rarely experienced closure. They treated men, handed them off, and moved on. They often never learned who survived. Later that afternoon, another injury occurred. Not from combat, heat exhaustion, severe dehydration. Keegan treated it with the same seriousness as gunshot wounds. In Vietnam, neglecting non-combat injuries could be fatal. Medics were responsible for everything from trauma care to tropical disease management. Malaria, fungal infections, immersion foot, dysentery. The environment itself was an enemy. By evening, the platoon established a night position. Keegan reorganized his aid bag, restocked what he could, cleaned what little could be cleaned. His hands were stained despite repeated wiping. He checked in on each man quietly, asking questions that sounded casual but were not. Dizziness, pain, breathing difficulty, these details mattered. Night fell quickly. Keegan lay awake longer than most. Medics slept lightly by necessity. They learned to rest without fully disengaging. In the darkness, the sounds of the jungle intensified. Somewhere in the distance, a flare illuminated the sky briefly. Somewhere else, artillery rumbled. Keegan thought about the wounded men already miles away in hospitals. He wondered if he had done enough. That question followed medics throughout the war. Statistically, Vietnam had one of the highest casualty survival rates of any major conflict to that point. Helicopter evacuation, forward surgical hospitals, and improved training saved lives. But statistics did not quiet individual doubt. Every medic remembered faces. They remembered hands grasping at sleeves, voices asking questions they could not answer. Keegan would finish his tour months later. He would return home with no medals of note. His contribution would be difficult to explain. He did not seize ground. He did not destroy enemy units. He delayed death long enough for someone else to intervene. That was the job. In Vietnam, survival often depended less on firepower than on whether someone like Keegan was close enough, fast enough, and steady enough when the moment arrived. Most firefights were brief, most wounds were sudden. The margin between life and death was measured in minutes. For the field medic, every day was defined by that margin. And the war was fought one wounded man at a time.